Today we examine World War I. In my last video, we spoke about imperialism and how several powerful nations extended their tentacles of influence across the globe. Empires got even more powerful, especially the Ottoman Empire. But before we begin speaking about World War I, let's examine the world map and find the little hotspot that will help explain everything that follows. Looking at the world map, if you look up in the north, that purple area, that is Russia. Now, Russia is landlocked with ice throughout most of the year. So Russia was looking to find a waterway, and it found something right around here going towards the Black Sea. There was a waterway called the Dardanelles. That waterway would allow Russia to enter the Mediterranean Sea. And after that, of course, world trade. So Russia was very interested in having that waterway open and keeping a close, friendly alliance with the Balkan states and Turkey. That small red area in the center is Britain, but as we pull back, all those red areas that you see there belong to England. That's why they say that the sun never sets on Great Britain. But if Britain wanted to reach India, its possession, it had to sail all the way around Africa. That was the only way to get there. But that was until they created a shortcut, and that was the Suez Canal in Egypt. Once they created the Suez Canal, that shortened the area, the distance was cut in two. Of course, England was very concerned about Russia muscling in on its territory. Germany, which you see here in green, was negotiating with Turkey, that you see in orange. It wanted to increase trade, but it also wanted to build a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad in present-day Iraq. To do this, the railroad would have to cross the Austrian Empire, and Austria was already having its problems with these Balkan states that were getting free of its and Turkey's rule. It was especially worried about Serbia and the radicals that were there. In Sarajevo, in today's Bosnia, on June 28, 1914, the Archduke of Austria and his wife were visiting. There was a motorcade, several cars were going by, people were lined up on the street, but some radicals came and threw bombs at the motorcade, wounding several. Now the Archduke and his wife in their car drove off, but they drove around the block and decided to visit the hospital to see the wounded. So what happened? As soon as they came out of the hospital, one of the radicals, Gavrilo Princip, 19 years old, went over and shot the Austrian Archduke and his wife. Well, Gavrilo was picked up along with the other radicals and they were all arrested and put in jail. So, justice was done, right? Well, not quite, because Austria believed that it was a Serbian assassination plot. So they blamed all of this on Serbia. And the King of Austria, Franz Joseph, was the Archduke's uncle. Now, he decides that he's going to go ahead and attack Serbia. So along with the foreign minister Leopold von Berchtold, and with support from the Kaiser Wilhelm II from Germany, they decided to attack Serbia. Now, if you look at the map, you can see that Germany and Austria should be able to take little Serbia without much trouble. However, there's a problem. Serbia had a very good friend up in the northeast, and that friend was Russia. Russia wanted its waterways open. It did not want disturbance, and it decided to declare war against Austria and Germany. So the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, mobilizes his troops. They're going to go out of Russia to attack Austria and the Tsar's cousin, Wilhelm II of Germany. So they get everybody on trains and they start rolling out of Russia. But lo and behold, when they got to the border, it was discovered that the railroad tracks outside of Russia were not the same width as those that were in Russia. So they had to get off the trains and get on horseback or mules and make their way on foot. Now, France had also pledged support to Serbia. So Germany told Austria, you hold off the Russians for a little while. They're being delayed. We're going to cross over and beat the French. And because the French had strong fortifications on its border, Germany decides to go around the northern tip through Belgium. What Germany didn't count on was the resourcefulness of the Belgian troops. They held off the Germans as long as they could, and after their land was occupied, they pulled back some, and the French joined them. This war was going into the long haul. Now, Great Britain was trying to stay out of the war all of this time, but when they saw the events taking place, once Germany crossed over to Belgium, and Belgium had an alliance with Great Britain, Britain decided to join the war. By this point, Germany, Austria, and later on Turkey and Bulgaria that would join them were known as the Central Powers. Britain declared war on them. And if you're wondering about the United States and all of this, they were trying to stay neutral, try to stay out of it. And Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, was declaring that the United States would not be joining this global war. Nevertheless, the rich, called the 400, the elite of the United States that had lent billions of dollars in today's currency over to England, was urging President Wilson to join Britain and the Allies against the Central Powers. Now, Britain joining the war meant that all its territories were also involved in the war. And this was the beginning of modern warfare. For the first time, we had the introduction of tanks, machine guns, poison gas, military airplanes that were dropping shells over the Allies and Central Powers. And the use of these shells caused the modern warfare to turn into a war of attrition, where shells would land and destroy entire villages and towns, many civilians killed. And barbed wire, lots and lots of barbed wire across the trenches. The Germans, the French, the Belgians, the British, the Austrians built along this 400-mile border a zigzagged line of trenches, and they would dig in and they would be there for over 2 years. Now, this trench warfare brought along some famous battles, the battles of Verdun, the battles of Somme, but for the most part, it was a stalemate. They would inch forward and inch back and stay in the trenches. And one of the fears in these trenches was that a shell would land on you and not just necessarily kill you, but bury you alive. And one of the things that the soldiers had to put up with was not just the freezing cold, dying of exposure, but also the constant deafening sound of the bombs and the smell of decomposing flesh. It was a horrible, horrible experience.
Front.
Wieder mehr als 40.000 Tote allein in den letzten Wochen.
Es ist vorbei.
Eventually, 31 nations and 61 million men would go to war. British officer T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, goes to the Ottoman Empire and incites the Arabs to rebel against the Turks. So far, the U.S. had stayed out of war, much to the delight of German Americans that were living in the United States. But that would change very suddenly. Merchant ships were sunk by German submarines. Now, notably, the British ocean liner, the Lusitania, was sunk, and there were 100 Americans on board. But the tipping point was the Zimmerman telegram. British intelligence had intercepted a telegram sent by a German foreign secretary named Alfred Zimmermann. And the telegram, if you pause it right over here on this video, you can see how the telegram was telling Mexico to join the war effort and attack the United States, and that later Germany would return Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back to Mexico. Well, that was the last straw. The U.S. was on its way. 1917. The war had taken its toll on Russia. It had lost about 3 million soldiers and civilians, with about another 3 million wounded. The Russians overthrew the Tsar Nicholas I in a revolution, and a second revolution by the Bolsheviks led by Nikolai Lenin would take over the country. As for the Tsar and his family, well, the Tsar was forced to abdicate the throne. He and his family were put into a small room, and they were all assassinated. Russia decided to abandon the war. It made peace with Germany. Lenin signed the peace treaty and lost vast territories, along with a third of his people. 90% of the coal mines were gone to Germany, and many oil fields. Russia now became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, a communist regime that would last about 70 years. But before this, Japan had invaded China. Why? Well, Japan was an ally of Russia. The Germans had a military base in the city of Qingdao in China. The Japanese invaded and took over. There was a German brewery there in the city of Qingdao, and well, later on this would be a Chinese brewery. And you may know about the Chinese beer, Qingdao. That's the story of its origin. Now, India had been dragged into the war by Britain. 74,000 Indians died in the war effort. But the continent of Africa would suffer even worse. Many of the Europeans, including the Germans, had colonies all over the continent, and they attacked each other. Africans joined in the effort, and over 2 million Africans died in World War I. Turkey focused its efforts on Armenia, a tiny little red area that you see here. Armenia was a Christian nation, and Turkey believed that it would support the Allies. So they decided to deport and massacre the Armenians. The number of dead is probably about 1.5 million, around there. And many nations have still not recognized the Armenian genocide, believing that they would offend Turkey. But it happened. Now that Germany did not have to worry about Russia, it concentrated its efforts over in France. General Erich von Ludendorff of Germany, along with General Hindenburg, decided to send every available soldier to the Western Front. But the French General Ferdinand Foch, he coordinated the efforts of the Allies, the British, the Americans, the French, and they counterattacked and smashed the German army. Nation after nation surrendered to the Allies. Austria-Hungary surrendered to the Italians. And then, by then, the German people in November of 1918, they had had enough. Civil war broke out in Germany, and the Kaiser, fearing for his life, fled to Switzerland. The Germans surrendered, a republic was formed, and the war was over. Over 23 million soldiers and civilians had died during the war. Now, the Allies were understandably angry, but they were also greedy. In the Paris peace talks, the Versailles Treaty was signed. There would be a League of Nations formed, a sort of United Nations at the time, but ironically, the United States President Wilson had formed it, but the U.S. Congress did not allow the country to join it. Germany was punished. It lost territory. It would not be allowed an army of over 100,000 troops, no more than 6 warships, no submarines, no military airplanes, and it was fined $5 billion at the time and another $32 billion to be paid in installments with interest. 4 empires collapsed. The Germans, the Austria-Hungary Empire, the Ottomans, and the Russians. They all broke out into smaller nations and new borders were formed. Now, what would have happened if the world had learned its lesson after 23 million dead from war, disease, and famine? If we could just learn to get along, yes, the nations can compete, but compete fairly. But no, blind ambition, money, and land grabbing would continue as usual. A lot of resentment would grow among the German people, especially with this young man right over here, a lance corporal from Germany by the name of Adolf Hitler. About 20 years later, he would plunge the world into an even greater war. But that's for another video.